Hello viewers, welcome to K Diagnostics. Dio here. Today we have a 2011 VW Tiguan with a 2.0 liter. The customer complaint is that the car has been overheating, and the customer also stated that the coolant level inside the coolant reservoir has been dropping. So he's been adding coolant to the car pretty much every 2 days. So with that information, that tells us that there is a coolant leak somewhere. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna get a cooling system pressure tester to actually, because right now I drove it in the shop and it's not leaking. I know there's a leak somewhere because the coolant level on the reservoir is low. It's actually below the minimum mark right now. So there's a leak, but it's not, we can't see it. So when we deal with leaks like this, we can either have an internal leak or an external leak. If it's an internal leak, it's going to be a little bit more complicated to find. But if it's an external leak, it's going to be easier to find. So let's start with the easy stuff first. We're going to need a cooling system pressure tester to pressurize the system so we can look around the engine and see if there's any external leak. If there's an external leak, it's going to be easy for us to fix. And knowing this TSI engines, they usually have issues with the water pump housing gaskets. So those gaskets on the water pump housing usually fail. I believe that's what the issue is, but we're gonna double check that by pressurizing the cooling system. So I'm gonna top off the coolant reservoir here, and then I'll get the cooling system pressure tester. Like I said, we're gonna pressurize it. Hopefully it's an external leak, and then if it's an internal leak, we're going to do more testing to find out where that internal leak is. So hopefully just an external leak that we can see easily and fix. So let's pressurize the cooling system and hopefully find the leak. I'm going to top off the cooling system here. Alright, so now I'm going to pressurize the cooling system so we can see where the leak is. So I'm gonna pressurize it up to 15 psi. There is the gauge on our pressure tester right there. I have pressurized it at 15 psi. So now I'm gonna grab a light so we can look around the engine bay and see if we're gonna find any external leaks. We have some coolant lines here and I don't see any external coolant leaks here. So I'm gonna lift up the car, or I'm gonna lift it up all the way so we can look underneath and see if there's any coolant leaks there. Alright, so I'm here under the vehicle and I'm trying to hold the light at a good angle so I can show you guys. Right there is our coolant leak. Right in there. I hope the camera is picking that up. So you guys see that coolant mark on that piece of plastic up there? So that's coolant leaking from up there, from the water pump housing. I hope that's enough. I can't really see it, but it just depends on how well the camera is gonna show that. Let me zoom in a little bit. Do you guys see there? It's all wet over there, and that's coolant. And it's definitely coming from up there, and there are actually a couple radiator hoses in the way, and this auxiliary water pump hoses in the way. So there's just a bunch of stuff in the way. You can't really see because the water pump is hidden under the intake manifold. So I hope this is good enough. I hope I'm showing you the leak. Or you're just gonna have to take my word for it, guys. The water pump is definitely leaking. So let's lower the car and get this water pump removed. Alright, so now that we have determined that the water pump is leaking, what we're gonna start with would be disconnecting the battery. So I'm gonna remove this battery cover, and then we're gonna remove this battery terminal. It's a 10 millimeter. I'm gonna disconnect this battery terminal. So the battery is disconnected. I am also gonna remove this filter, this air filter housing. I'm gonna disconnect this mass airflow sensor. I'm gonna also remove this engine cover. Engine cover is removed. Now I'm gonna Alright, so the filter housing just pops off. So right there comes our air filter box. Now we just gained enough room around this area. So the next step is going to be, I'm gonna remove this, and then I will seat you guys over here. I'll put the camera here so you guys can have a better shot of what I'm gonna do next. Alright, so now that we got the air filter box out of the way, the next step is going to be focusing on the intake manifold. We're going to remove the entire intake manifold so that we can get access to the water pump. So I'm going to seat you guys over here so you can have a better view of what I'm about to do. So I got most of the electrical connectors and intake tube disconnected. I'm gonna show you what I'm about to do next. So I got pretty much all these tubes and all these electrical connectors disconnected. So what I'm about to do next is removing these intake bolts. They're actually torque bolts. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm gonna remove these, and then there's a high pressure fuel line right here coming from that fuel pump over there. So I'm gonna disconnect it from that point right there. So once I remove all these intake manifold bolts, and I'm gonna remove this line, and then the next step is going to be moving this throttle body. So this inlet air tube. I hope you guys can see that tube over there. It goes all the way down. So I'm gonna disconnect that sensor too. So disconnect the sensor, get this tube off, remove all the bolts, and then the intake manifold should be able to come off. So let's do that. Alright, so here comes intake manifold. I'm actually removing the injectors because some injectors stayed on the head. So now I'm removing the injectors. So I got this one out of the way. Now I'm gonna disconnect the other two. Alright, so here comes our intake manifold, and as you guys can see, I got the intake manifold out of the way. Two injectors stayed on the injector fuel rail, and then two came out. I mean, they actually stayed on the head, so I had to pull them out. So now I'm gonna get the intake out of the way. So the next step is going to be getting these wiring. Just gonna put this wiring on the side here. This wiring just put on the side, and then the next step is going to be disconnecting this coolant temperature sensor. So here comes our coolant temperature sensor. So all I'm doing is just putting this wiring on the side. So I'm gonna show you how everything looks now. So here we are. We got the intake manifold removed, and here is the water pump and its housing. So this is the water pump here, and this is the water pump housing. And as you can see in there, we got coolant. So that's coolant in there. And I believe the coolant is leaking from this water pump housing gasket. Once I take it out, I will show you exactly what I mean. But there's a little belt here that drives the water pump. So now the next step is going to be, I'm going to disconnect these radiator hoses. So there's this one right here, this big one. So I'm going to disconnect this radiator hose, and I'm going to disconnect these hero hoses. So I'm going to disconnect this and this one because it goes back to the cylinder head. And I'm going to pretty much disconnect all the hoses, and then I will remove this belt cover. Once this cover is removed, then we will remove the belt and remove the water pump. Okay, and the water pump housing is got, because we are replacing the whole housing. We're just not replacing the water pump itself. So the water pump and the housing will be replaced. So it's got a couple bolts. There's one here, another one down here. Hopefully you guys can see. Yeah. So there's one here, another one there, and another bolt right there. So once we get all of these bolts, I think there's another one underneath here. Once we get these hoses out of the way, we will get access to the other bolt that's underneath. And once we remove this, the water pump and its housing should be able to come out. So let's do that next. Alright, so I got the heater hoses and the radiator upper and lower radiator hoses disconnected. So now our water pump and water pump housing is ready to come out. I'm actually gonna remove this water pump belt cover first. So it has two bolts, one here and another one over here, which I already removed. I'm gonna remove these bolts first so I can remove the water pump housing. So here comes our water pump and its housing. So usually these water pumps leak from the gasket right here. And as you guys can see, oh, this thing is broken. Can you see right here? Right there. It's broken. So that's where the leak is. I will show you the new one so you can see. You guys see the break right there? So this section, I don't know how it broke though. This is weird. Yeah. And you see how swollen this gasket has become. So it wasn't even sitting properly. And these gaskets actually stretch over time with the heat and everything. They do stretch, but you see how this one is like sitting nicely? But look at this one. Can't even get it to stay. So this is definitely where our leak is. And then it was actually leaking past here and going under the water pump, which was eventually falling on this black cover there. Okay, so here is our water pump and its housing. So I'm gonna put this aside and look at this sleeve. See how dirty this is. So I'm gonna replace all this stuff. The belt, actually I don't think the belt is gonna be able to come out unless we remove that gear, unless we remove this gear here. And I have another belt for it. I can put a new belt on there and remove it. So let me show you. So here's the old one. Let me show you the new one that I ordered, so you can see the difference. So I'm just gonna sit the new one right there. I mean the old one up here. Let me go grab the new stuff. So here's the new one. Can you tell the difference right here? You see how this one is kind of looking good, it's not broken? And look at the old one. Just tell the, you see the difference right there? See this one and this one right here? Let me remove this gasket so you can see. See, look at here. Look at right here around this area. Right there. See right there? See the difference? So this is definitely a problem. So I'm gonna, I'm gonna trash this. We're gonna install this new one, and this is the new sleeve that goes over here between the housing and the oil cooler over there. So we're gonna install this. I'm gonna clean everything. I will clean this intake manifold matting surface here. I'll clean everything up, and then we're gonna start assembling everything. Pretty much putting everything back together is just the reverse process of the removal process. And then I'm gonna remove this tiny water pump belt too. So to remove this, if I put a wrench here, it's gonna spin this gear. So what I'm gonna have to do, I'm gonna have to hold the crankshaft stationary by holding it somewhere here around the bell housing. So I'm just gonna put a pry bar there or screwdriver to hold the crankshaft, because you just don't want it to spin, otherwise we won't be able to remove that gear. So I'm gonna hold it, remove the gear, install a new belt there, and then we're gonna clean up so we can install our new water pump and its housing. Okay, so I'm gonna do that, and then I'll bring you guys back up. All right, so I'm ready to install our new water pump with its housing. I got the intake manifold matting surface here cleaned up. I also replaced the water pump belt, which is this tiny little belt right here. The gear for the water pump belt is actually a reverse thread bolt. I mean the bolt for the gear. So tightening it will be coming towards the outside of the vehicle, and then loosening it would be going towards the inside of the vehicle. So it's a reversed thread bolt, just remember that. So now what I'm gonna do is, there's a little sleeve here that goes between the water pump housing and the oil cooler here. So there are also two dowel pins here, so we have to make sure that we align these dowel pins with the holes here on the new water pump housing. So what I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna actually press this the sleeve here on the new water pump housing. So we're gonna go this way. It's a little bit tricky to install, so just be patient. It requires a little bit of finesse. So right there, and then you kind of work the belt in as you're trying to line up everything. So I've got the belt lined up and my dowel pins, yeah, so right there. The belt is on the gear. Okay, so my water pump and housing is installed. So it's got 4 bolts. Actually it has 3 bolts that are the same length, and then a shorter bolt which actually goes over here. So I'm gonna start with the shorter one. And you don't want to cross threads these bolts, so make sure you start them by hand, and then you can put the your electric tool or your ratchet afterwards. You can apply a little bit more torque to them afterwards. All right, so the water pump and its housing has been installed. I actually tightened all these 4 bolts by hand first before I actually use the ratchet, because you don't want to cross thread these bolts, because if you do, you're screwed. The torque for these water pump housing bolts is 12 foot-pound. I'm actually going to use a small inch-pound torque wrench here, so we just have to convert 12 foot-pound to inch-pound. So 12 foot-pound equals 180 inch-pounds, around that number. So we're gonna use this inch-pound torque wrench to torque these bolts. Alright, so I torqued all the water pump housing bolts. I'm gonna show you how everything looks now, and as you can see, I'm sorry for the glare here of the light. The belt, I got the belt installed, so the belt is right there in place, and I torqued all these bolts down. Now the next step is gonna be installing the coolant temp sensor, and then I will start putting everything back together. Alright, so now I'm gonna put the water pump belt cover back on. All right, so everything is coming back together slowly. I got all these lines almost ready to get connected. So I'm gonna connect this bottom, this lower radiator hose. All right, so now I'm gonna install the intake manifold. So before I do that, I'm gonna connect these injector electrical connectors first.